I'm writing my thesis on why the DC metro system is accessible and the political and legal battles to make it accessible. The attitude around accessibility when metro was first planned was at best laissez-faire. They kind of figured, we've got escalators, most disabled people can use those. They were so obsessed with this idea to the point where one of the men who was in charge of planning metro, who was a former general, went to Bethesda Medical Center and got a bunch of crutches and canes and other things he thought disabled people would use. And he and a bunch of consultants hopped in a car and went out to Dulles. He strapped all these accessibility aids to himself and rode up and down the escalator and made these consultants film him in an attempt to prove that disabled people could use the escalator, which obviously is not true. It was a fight to make metro as accessible, and I'm glad that people like Richard Hedinger, who was one of the main plaintiffs on the lawsuit that ordered metro to be accessible, fought those battles. My name is Bryce Maples. I'm a George Washington University student, which is how I ended up here in DC. I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was born with a disability. It's called Charcot-Marie-Tooth. It's a form of muscular dystrophy. Long story short, basically it just makes my muscles weaker and limits my fine motor skills. As you can see, the biggest impact is I'm in a wheelchair. I can walk a little, but for any sort of distance, I need to use a wheelchair, which means when I'm going to school or really going anywhere, I need to be able to get myself in my wheelchair there, which the fact that the DC Metro Rail is accessible is huge. It's one of the biggest reasons I decided to live in DC. Just the sense of freedom that I'm allowed by being able to use any stop, any station, any train, which is something that is not afforded in New York or Boston or Chicago. I use Metro every week, almost every day, to get to school. Every morning I get an email at about 5 a.m. from WMATA, which tells me if any of the elevators on my commute are broken, which is very helpful. Just in the time since I started college back in 2019, WMATA has gotten better at fixing elevators. It's definitely become a lot less common for me to be stuck because an elevator is broken than it was a handful of years ago. So I would definitely commend WMATA on that. And I'd especially commend them on the fact that they now, in the past 20, 30 years, realized that stations need to have redundant elevators. So if one elevator breaks, the station is still usable for people with disabilities. It's one of the biggest reasons I chose to live near Friendship Heights Metro Station, because it's one of the, if not the only station in DC itself that has redundant elevators. So I know that even if one elevator breaks, I'm not out of luck. I can take a different one. As part of my research, I've come to find out that many of the core stations in downtown DC, such as Farragut North, Farragut West, Gallery Place, Metro Center, the ones you can think of, were all designed and significantly built before elevators were required in the system. This means that they are afterthoughts. You can clearly see this at LaFont Plaza, where there's the whole back and forth single file fence deal, which is really inaccessible. You can see this at places like Gallery Place just by how small the elevators are and how out of the way they are. Whereas if you go out to Friendship Heights, or definitely the newer stations, Noma, Gallaudet, you find that those are designed with elevators in mind. Now that I think about it, I believe Noma is the only other station in DC itself which has redundant elevators, because both Friendship Heights and Noma are newer stations. You can really tell how much better things have gotten by going to Noma and seeing how huge those elevators are. And they're generally very reliable from my experience. When the Metro was first opened, at least for the very first few years, in order to take the elevator, you wouldn't actually call the elevator. Rather, you would have to press the intercom button and speak with the station manager and have them turn on the elevator. I am unclear as to when exactly that stopped being how it worked, but I do know that because of that, in many of the downtown stations, the buttons are laid out in a very confusing way that makes it seem like the emergency intercom is actually the elevator call button. This means tourists and other people who just aren't really familiar with the system are often calling the emergency call button, which is obviously a problem because it makes it less effective during actual emergencies, and also it's just inconvenient for everyone involved. The 7000 series has a very nice designated spot for me to put my wheelchair, and I'm also able to get completely from one side of the car to the other side of the car in my wheelchair. Whereas in the 3000 and 6000 series, there's lots of poles and other things in the way, which means there's not really a great space for me to put my wheelchair in the first place, but also I cannot get from one side of the car to the other side of the car in my chair. MARC is Maryland's commuter rail, and it's okay. As far as the accessibility of commuter rail in the US, it's really quite bad. I'm not familiar with any systems that are actually fully accessible. Today we took the Penn Line, which uses Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. So there's actually only one stop in between Baltimore and DC, which is inaccessible, which is West Baltimore, which is going to be replaced soon. That doesn't mean MARC is perfect. You can't check online if the elevators are working, which is a huge barrier to access. You just never really know what you're going to get on MARC. Sometimes you need to be loaded up on a big platform where the conductor physically has to crank and hoist you up. That's especially true for the Camden and the Brunswick lines. But as you saw with the Northeast Corridor on the Penn Line, I was able to use a bridge plate to get on the MARC, which is just a little plastic ramp that goes over the gap in between the platform and the train. This is better than nothing, obviously, but there's no reason that America's flagship rail line shouldn't have level boarding, especially since it would just make everyone's life easier. It would make my life easier. It would make conductors' lives easier because they wouldn't have to get off their train, get a platform, get it on, get back on their train. This causes delays. It increases dwell time. Simply just having level boarding in the first place, it is better for everyone. Washington, D.C. is one of, if not the best place to live in the country if you're a person with a disability and you want to use rail transit. It's just needs some more investment, and it needs some serious commitment. I think that the DC area tends to kind of ride on its high horse of being fully accessible and isn't willing to improve. And there's always room to improve, especially with equity. Many of the most accessible stations are in richer neighborhoods, many of the least accessible and disinvested stations are in poorer neighborhoods, and that needs to be fixed.